Are you sure you're in the right class?
I don't feel comfortable with a black woman flying this plane.
Let her scream into the void. This will blow over.
For years, Captain Naomi Ellis faced moments like these: doubt, dismissal, and outright discrimination. But when her own airline refused to believe she was a pilot, they made a fatal mistake. This time, she didn't stay silent, and what followed shook the entire industry. Stay till the end to see how one woman took down an entire airline. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Captain Naomi Ellis had spent years walking through airport terminals with an unshakable confidence. She had spent thousands of hours in the cockpit, guiding massive commercial planes through turbulent skies, making split-second decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But today, standing in the lobby of SkyWest Global Airlines headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, she felt something different, a sinking feeling in her stomach that told her this wasn't going to be a smooth landing. She adjusted the strap of her leather flight bag over her shoulder, her polished navy blazer crisp against her frame. She had dressed professionally, even though this was her day off. If she had learned anything from working in this industry as a black woman, it was that she always had to present herself at the highest standard. No room for error, no room for doubt. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, sealing out the humid Atlanta air as the cool blast of the building's AC hit her skin. The lobby was sleek, modern, and pristine. Too pristine, the kind of place where the furniture was more for show than for actual use. The walls were lined with framed photos of airplanes, company achievements, and grinning executives, almost all of whom were white and male. Naomi walked toward the reception desk, where a young woman, Samantha, sat clicking away at a keyboard. Her manicured nails made a rhythmic tapping sound, her focus locked on the screen in front of her. Naomi gave a polite nod and placed her airline ID on the counter. "Good morning. I'm Captain Naomi Ellis. I have a meeting scheduled with the executive board today." Samantha didn't look up. "Employees and visitors need to wait outside." Naomi blinked. Maybe she had misheard. Maybe Samantha was just distracted. I'm an employee," she clarified, keeping her voice steady. "I'm a senior captain and I have a meeting here. You can check the list. It should be under Ellis." Still, no eye contact. "Pilots enter through the restricted access side," Samantha said flatly, fingers still moving over the keyboard. "This area is for executives and senior staff." Naomi felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, a weight she had carried for years, the kind that came with constantly having to prove herself. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "I know where the pilot entrance is, but I'm not here as a pilot today. I'm here as a guest for a meeting," Naomi said, tapping her ID on the counter again. This time, Samantha finally looked up, but only to give Naomi a once-over, her eyes scanning Naomi's face, then her attire, then back to her face. There it was, that flicker of doubt, the moment of hesitation before deciding whether or not to believe her. "I'm sorry, but unless you're authorized, I can't let you in," Samantha said, pressing her lips into a thin line. Before Naomi could respond, movement caught her eye. Two pilots, both white, both dressed casually in jeans and button-downs, strolled in behind her. "Morning," one of them said with a friendly grin. Samantha's face lit up immediately. "Oh, Captain Reynolds, Captain Harris, you can head right in." She waved them through without even checking their names. Naomi turned, watching them disappear down the hallway. Then she turned back to Samantha, her voice calm but firm. "I just saw you let them in without checking anything," she said. "Why am I being asked to wait outside?" Samantha's smile tightened. "They've been here before. I recognize them." Naomi exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of her bag a little tighter. "I've worked for this airline for 12 years," she said, her voice steady but laced with controlled frustration. "I've flown hundreds of flights. I've logged thousands of hours in the air. You don't recognize me." Samantha hesitated, but before she could answer, a shadow loomed over them. A uniformed security guard had stepped forward. Broad-shouldered, arms crossed, his presence alone was meant to be a warning. "Is there a problem?" he asked, looking directly at Naomi. The air in the room shifted. People in the lobby weren't looking directly at them, but Naomi could feel their attention. The way they were suddenly aware of the situation, the way they were pretending not to notice but listening anyway. Naomi had been in too many moments like this before. A black woman standing her ground while the people around her waited for her to become the problem. She squared her shoulders, making sure to keep her posture strong, her voice level. "No problem at all," she said. "I'm just trying to get to my meeting." The guard glanced at Samantha, as if waiting for confirmation. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Naomi, "if you don't have the right clearance, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Naomi's fingers curled into a tight fist around her bag strap. Everything inside her screamed at her to just walk away. Let it go. Ignore it. She had done that before. Too many times before. But not today. She locked eyes with Samantha. "Check the list." Samantha let out an exaggerated sigh as if Naomi was inconveniencing her. She clicked a few keys, her screen lighting up with information. A beat passed. Then another. And then Naomi saw it, the moment Samantha realized she had made a mistake. Her eyes widened slightly. She cleared her throat. "Oh, I see you here." Naomi didn't move. She didn't blink. She just waited. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. Just a begrudging admission that Naomi had been telling the truth all along. "You can go in," Samantha said, looking back at her screen. Naomi held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, with calculated precision, she picked up her airline ID from the counter and walked through the doors without another word. But inside her, something shifted. She had spent years dealing with moments like this. The quiet slights, the subtle dismissals, the way people always seemed to question her presence in a profession she had earned her place in. But today, it wasn't going to be just another moment she walked away from. Because today, she had proof. And this time, she wasn't letting it slide. Naomi Ellis walked through the sleek, glass-paneled doors of Sky West Global Airlines executive wing, her pulse steady, her face unreadable. From an outsider's perspective, it looked like nothing had happened. She was just another pilot walking into a meeting. But inside, she was seething. She tightened her grip on her flight bag as she strode down the pristine hallway, the echoes of her heels tapping against the marble floor mixing with the distant hum of office chatter. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a begrudging, "You may go in," after everything. After making her stand outside like she didn't belong, after the dismissive tone. After calling security on her like she was some random intruder rather than a senior captain who had logged thousands of flight hours. But it was fine. Naomi didn't need an apology. What she needed, what she had decided in that moment, was to make sure this never happened again. She reached the conference room, its towering glass doors open just enough for her to see inside. A long, polished table stretched across the space, lined with executives in tailored suits, their expressions a mix of seriousness and corporate smugness. At the front, a projector displayed a slide with the words, "Commitment to diversity and inclusion, building a stronger future." Naomi almost laughed. The irony was suffocating. Taking a deep breath, she walked in and took an empty seat near the middle, smoothing her blazer as she settled in. The meeting had already started, but no one had noticed her absence. No one had wondered where she was or why she had been delayed. She might as well have been invisible. At the head of the table, James Holloway, one of the company's senior executives, stood with a practiced smile, gesturing toward the screen. At SkyWest Global Airlines, we remain deeply committed to fostering an inclusive environment where all employees feel valued and supported. Our diversity initiatives continue to make a real impact in the aviation industry. Naomi leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. She had heard all of this before. She had heard it in every memo, in every PR statement, in every corporate training session that conveniently ignored the real problems. The irony of it all sat like a weight in her chest, pressing down harder with every passing second. They were talking about diversity. She had just been denied entry into this very building because the receptionist didn't believe she belonged here. They were talking about inclusivity. She had just watched 2 white pilots walk in, unchecked, unquestioned, while she had to stand there, prove herself, and almost be escorted out by security. The disconnect between their words and reality was almost laughable. And then, as she listened to them congratulate themselves, the memories started flooding back. Flight school. Naomi could still hear the laughter. She was 19 years old, standing in a classroom full of hopeful pilots, eager to begin her journey. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, working harder than anyone else just to earn a seat in that room. And then, the instructor looked straight at her and smirked. "Are you sure you're in the right class?" The words weren't a joke, not really, and the room had erupted in laughter. Naomi had forced a smile, her stomach twisting as she nodded. "Yes, sir, I am." Her first time in the cockpit as a co-pilot, she had spent years training for this, earning her place, proving herself. And yet the captain, a middle-aged white man, did a double take when he saw her. "Did you just graduate? You look a little green." She had been flying for 4 years at that point, passengers refusing to board when they saw her in uniform. It had happened more than once. A passenger would be walking toward the plane, glance at the cockpit, see her sitting in the captain's seat, and suddenly have a change of heart. One man had even demanded to switch flights, openly saying he didn't feel comfortable with a black woman flying the plane. Naomi had watched as the gate agent bent over backward to accommodate him, instead of telling him to sit down and shut up, being called a diversity hire. It didn't matter how many perfect landings she executed, didn't matter how many long-haul flights she completed flawlessly. Didn't matter how she had climbed the ranks through sheer determination and skill. Someone always had a comment. "They're only keeping you around so they can put you on the website. Gotta love those diversity quotas, huh? Bet it looks real good on their reports to have you here." And the worst part, half the time, they said it to her face, as if she should be grateful to be included at all. Sitting in that conference room, listening to these executives talk about diversity like it was just another corporate strategy, Naomi felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about today. It wasn't just about one moment at the front desk. It was about a lifetime of moments just like it. She had spent her entire career keeping her head down, working twice as hard, letting things slide. Not anymore. She straightened in her seat, her fingers resting on the smooth surface of the table. James Holloway was still talking, still throwing out buzzwords and empty promises. Naomi raised her hand. The room fell silent as Holloway glanced at her, clearly surprised she was speaking. "Captain Ellis," he said with a forced smile. "Do you have something to add?" Naomi's heart pounded, but her voice was calm. "Yes, actually I do," she said, meeting his gaze head-on. The old Naomi might have let this meeting play out, might have let them pat themselves on the back and walked away quietly. But not today. Not this time, because she wasn't just going to sit here and let them pretend. She was done staying silent. Naomi sat at her desk, staring at the blank email draft in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, not out of fear, but out of frustration. She had done this before, filed complaints, sent emails, reported incidents, and what had she gotten in return? A generic response, a brush-off, a quiet dismissal. It was always the same story. We take all concerns seriously. We will review the situation internally. We regret that you feel this way. That one always got her. We regret that you feel this way. Not we regret that this happened. Not we acknowledge the mistake. Just a cold, passive attempt to shift blame onto her emotions instead of their actions. Naomi clenched her jaw and forced herself to breathe. She knew how this would play out if she went through official channels. They would drag their feet, maybe schedule a diversity discussion to pacify her. Maybe call her in for a meeting with HR, where they'd act concerned but ultimately tell her there wasn't enough evidence to prove discrimination. They'd wait for her to get tired, to let it go, and in a few months, nothing would change, not this time. She was done playing by their rules. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She needed a bigger audience. She needed someone who would actually listen, and she knew exactly who to call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Naomi, it's been a while," she smiled slightly. "Jacob Mayers, investigative journalist for the New York Times." She had met him years ago, back when he was covering an aviation scandal about unsafe airline practices. Back then, she had trusted him to report the truth, and now, she was trusting him again. "Jacob," she said, getting straight to the point, "I have a story for you." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm listening." Naomi took a deep breath and started from the beginning. She told him everything. The incident at the front desk, the blatant double standard, the years of subtle and not so subtle discrimination she had faced in the industry. She didn't just talk about herself. She talked about the bigger picture. How black pilots, especially black women, were systematically overlooked, doubted, and disrespected. How they were paid less, promoted slower, and treated like anomalies instead of professionals. How passengers openly questioned their competence. How airline leadership preached diversity in public but ignored racism behind closed doors. When she finished, Jacob let out a slow breath. "Jesus, Naomi," he muttered. This is huge." "I know," she said, "and I need people to hear it." There was no hesitation in his voice when he responded. "I'm on it." The article dropped 2 weeks later. The headline was blunt. Black female pilot denied entry at her own airline's office, told to wait outside while white colleagues walked in. Naomi read it 3 times, her heart pounding. It was everywhere. Social media exploded. Aviation forums, news sites, even mainstream morning shows were talking about it. People shared the article thousands of times, flooding the airline's Twitter and Facebook pages with demands for accountability. And then, something Naomi hadn't expected started happening. Her inbox filled up overnight. Emails, messages, calls, from pilots she knew, from pilots she didn't know, from former employees who had long since left the industry, beaten down by the same system she was fighting against. "This happened to me too. I was pushed out after I complained. I have proof. Where can I send it?" Naomi sat on her couch, scrolling through the messages, her pulse racing. She had known this problem was big. But seeing it spelled out in hundreds of messages, hearing how many people had been through the same battles, the same humiliations, the same injustices, was overwhelming. And it wasn't just pilots. Passengers started speaking up too. One woman shared a post about a flight she had taken years ago. "I remember feeling relieved when I saw a white pilot taking over from a black one. I hate that I thought that way." Another wrote, "I once watched a flight attendant question a black pilot while letting her white co-pilot walk through without a second glance. It made me sick, but I didn't say anything. I should have. It was like a dam had broken. The more people spoke up, the more stories flooded in. And just like that, SkyWest Global Airlines' carefully curated image of diversity and progress started cracking. Within 24 hours, the airline released a statement. We are conducting an internal review regarding recent allegations. We remain committed to diversity, inclusion, and fairness. Naomi almost laughed when she read it. It was weak, generic. The kind of copy-paste response companies always threw out when they were trying to contain a scandal. And it didn't work. The pressure didn't ease, it built. Stockholders started asking questions. Passengers demanded refunds. Flight crews refused to stay silent. And then, the final blow. One of the biggest newspapers in the country published an investigative report digging into years of buried discrimination complaints at the airline. They exposed pay gaps between white and black pilots, a pattern of retaliation against employees who spoke up, a history of ignored complaints, including some nearly identical to Naomi's. She read every word, she had lived it, and now everyone else saw it too. The executives, the ones who had brushed her off so easily, were now scrambling. They weren't in control anymore. Naomi had forced them to listen. And this was just the beginning. Naomi had expected backlash. She had expected pushback, denials, the usual corporate damage control. A few PR statements, maybe a hastily organized internal meeting, and then a slow return to business as usual. But what she hadn't expected, not like this, was for the entire foundation of SkyWest Global Airlines to start crumbling beneath its own weight. And it all started with the numbers. The moment Naomi's story went viral, investors panicked. Within days, SkyWest's stock price took a nosedive, wiping out millions in market value overnight. Customers weren't just angry, they were pulling their money out. Frequent flyers canceled memberships. Corporate travel accounts froze contracts. Passengers started boycotting flights altogether. The company's reputation, once carefully curated, protected by glossy advertisements and staged diversity campaigns, was now under siege. And as bad as it was about to get worse. Naomi was sitting at her kitchen counter, sipping coffee and scrolling through another wave of messages from pilots and passengers when her phone lit up with a notification. A journalist she had spoken to at the New York Times had just published an update. Her eyes landed on the headline. Leaked email shows SkyWest executives mocking discrimination claims. Let her scream into the void. Naomi's stomach tightened. She clicked the article, her breath catching as she read. It was a private email exchange between two senior executives at SkyWest, sent just hours after her story first made headlines. "This will blow over like it always does," one of them had written. "Let her scream into the void." People forget these things in a week. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. The arrogance, the utter disregard. They thought she was just another inconvenience, another scandal to sweep under the rug. But this time, it wasn't going away. The email leak set off a firestorm. Within 24 hours, multiple news outlets began digging deeper. And what they found, it wasn't just one mistake. It wasn't just Naomi's story. It was years of systemic discrimination, buried complaints, ignored reports, and deliberate retaliation against employees who had spoken out. The findings were damning. Black pilots at SkyWest were paid, on average, 20% less than their white counterparts, even with identical experience. Discrimination complaints had been filed by dozens of employees over the years, all dismissed or lost. Multiple black employees had been fired or quietly pushed out after raising concerns about racism. The airline's leadership had known all of this, and they had done nothing. The moment the reports went live, the pressure became unbearable. Stockholders were furious. Passengers were demanding refunds. The company's legal team was scrambling to contain the damage. And then, the final blow: SkyWest CEO Richard Callaway resigned, effective immediately. Naomi watched the press conference from her laptop, arms crossed, as Callaway, the same man who had ignored every previous complaint, stood at the podium, eyes dull, spouting half-hearted apologies. "I regret that past actions within our company have caused harm," he said, voice measured, rehearsed. "SkyWest has always been committed to diversity and fairness, and we will work to regain the trust of our employees and customers." Naomi almost laughed. He wasn't sorry for what they did. He was sorry they got caught, and he wasn't sticking around for the consequences. But the consequences were coming whether he was there or not. Within days, the lawsuits poured in. Naomi had already filed her own case, but now, she wasn't alone. Current and former employees sued for racial discrimination and wrongful termination. Black pilots who had been passed over for promotions came forward with evidence. Flight attendants and ground crew members filed claims of harassment and bias. One after another, the cases piled up, each one adding to the weight dragging SkyWest down. And soon, even the company's financial backers started jumping ship. For decades, SkyWest had thrived, propped up by major investors, corporate sponsorships, and government contracts. But now, the lawsuits were bad for business, and when money starts bleeding, loyalty disappears fast. One by one, corporate investors pulled their funding. Sponsorship deals were dropped. Government contracts were suspended pending review. SkyWest tried to fight it. They hired PR firms. They rolled out new diversity pledges. They even flashed pictures of their one black executive in every interview, desperately trying to prove they weren't what the world now knew them to be. But it was too late. Naomi was standing in her apartment, flipping through her phone when she saw the news alert. She froze, her eyes scanning the words, and then she read it again and again. Major U.S. airline files for bankruptcy amid discrimination scandal. Naomi let out a slow breath, her chest rising and falling as the reality sank in. SkyWest Global Airlines, the same company that had dismissed her, humiliated her, tried to silence her, was now gone. They had bet against her. They had assumed she would stay silent. They had thought they could sweep this under the rug like they always did. But this time, they lost. She had forced them to face the truth. And in the end, that truth had destroyed them. Naomi sat in her new office, fingers lightly tapping the edge of her desk as she looked out at the city skyline. It still felt surreal. The journey from that humiliating moment at the front desk to this moment now, where she had power, influence, and the ability to create real change. SkyWest Global Airlines was gone, but that was never the end goal. She hadn't fought this battle just to bring down a corporation. She had fought it to build something better. And now, that was exactly what she was going to do. The Ellis Aviation Initiative was more than just a name. It was a mission. With her lawsuit settlement money, combined with private donors, former pilots, and advocacy groups, Naomi created an organization dedicated to providing scholarships for aspiring black pilots and other underrepresented groups in aviation, offering mentorship programs, pairing young pilots with experienced professionals who could guide them, fighting legal battles, ensuring that no one else would be forced to stand alone against discrimination in the industry, holding airlines accountable so that they could never again sweep injustices under the rug. She wasn't just changing one company. She was changing the entire industry. The conference hall was packed. Rows of young pilots, some fresh out of training, others still dreaming of their first cockpit experience, filled the seats, their faces eager, determined, and hopeful. In the crowd, Naomi recognized veteran pilots who had fought the same fights she had, former SkyWest employees who had testified alongside her, and allies who had stood by her when things got tough. This wasn't just her victory, this was their victory. Naomi stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. For a moment, she just looked at the crowd, really looked. She saw black pilots, Latina pilots, Asian pilots, indigenous pilots, people who just a few years ago would have been seen as exceptions rather than the norm. And then she spoke. "I spent years believing that if I kept my head down, worked twice as hard and proved myself over and over again, things would change." She let the words sink in before continuing. "But I learned the hard way that silence doesn't fix broken systems, that playing by their rules doesn't stop discrimination." Naomi paused, scanning the room. "And that when one of us speaks up, we give others the courage to do the same." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. She nodded, her voice steady. "I didn't fight this fight to bring down an airline, I fought it to change an industry." The room was silent now, every set of eyes locked on her, and we're just getting started. The applause was deafening. People stood, clapped, cheered, not just for Naomi but for what she represented, for the change that was finally happening, for the future that now felt possible. And as Naomi stood there, taking it all in, she realized something for the first time in a long, long time. She wasn't just fighting to be seen. She was leading the way. As the event came to a close, reporters gathered, cameras flashing, microphones pushed toward her. Naomi knew the question was coming before they even asked it. "Captain Ellis, what message do you want people to take away from your journey?" She didn't hesitate. She looked straight into the camera, her voice clear and unwavering. "Never stay silent in the face of injustice. Because when one voice speaks up, an entire generation can follow." And this time, the whole world was listening.